Imagine if you were fast asleep in your bed and all of a sudden you get woken up because your phone is buzzing there on your bedside table, and you sort of think it's a little bit strange that somebody's calling that late in the night. Maybe it's an emergency or something like that, but you kind of sit up a little bit and you kind of wipe the sleep from your eyes and you pick up your phone and you open up the cover and you see this. Dan, if you just put it up, I mean, you'd probably be like, whoa! You'd be like, wow, I didn't even know Jesus was in my contacts. Maybe you'd think that there was a friend who was playing a trick on you, or you were just in some kind of dream. You open your phone and you see that Jesus is calling. But I wonder, maybe if that really was to happen. Just imagine that. Imagine if it really was Jesus on the other end of the line. I wonder, what would he say to you right now, in the moment sort of that you're in your life at the moment? What would his words be to you? I want to suggest that maybe if Jesus was to give you a personal call right now, if he was to give me a personal call, he might say something like this: Jack, why don't you put out into the deep? Marnie, why don't you put out into the deep? This is what we see here in this passage. Jesus comes and he calls Simon Peter, and this is what he says to him: why don't you put out into the deep? But Jesus, we've just cleaned our nets for the morning. And you have to understand, Jesus, that we toiled all night and we're pretty tired and we've caught nothing. Why don't you put out into the deep? Well, it defies logic, doesn't it? You don't catch fish at this hour. You don't catch fish in the daytime. You catch it in the night. Maybe running through Peter's mind here is, hang on, I'm the commercial fisherman here. I'm the professional, and you're the carpenter, and you're a part-time preacher, and you're telling me to put out into the deep. There's something wrong here. But Peter can tell that Jesus isn't joking, that Jesus has his game face on. He's serious, and he has seen Jesus at work in Capernaum. In fact, what we know is that Jesus actually already visited Peter's home and healed his mother-in-law. And so he had seen him do some amazing things. Jesus isn't like other teachers. There's something about him that has the whole town captivated. And so Peter kind of clears his throat and he says, well, okay, at your word, I will let down the nets. So imagine this, they're pushing out the boats and they're kind of in the morning blazing sun, and as they're going out, there's other boats coming in and they're sort of looking at them sideways like, what are you guys doing? And all Peter's mates are sort of thinking, why are we going out there now? We've caught nothing all night. What are we doing? But nevertheless, they go out there and they throw out their nets into the deep and they do the real business of fishing, which is waiting. But then starts bubbling in the water. If you've ever been fishing, you know that bubbling in the water is a good sign. There's bubbling in the water, and then it turns into frothing, and the tails of 1,000 fish fill up their nets. So many fish that Peter and his men, they try to pull it in, they're trying to pull in the nets, but actually, as they try and pull in the nets, there's so many fish that the nets are pulling them into the water. And so Peter yells out to his mates in the other boat and says, quick, come and help us. Come and help us pull them all in. And so their backs are breaking as they pull in all of these fish. And when they've finally done, they stand back and there's no room for them to stand. Both boats are just filled with fish. They've never seen anything like this. They've never had a night out fishing like this. And then Simon Peter, he looks up at Jesus, who's somewhere at the head of the boat, and who had told him to put out into the deep, and he falls down on his knees and he says, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. Why don't you put out into the deep? That's what the call of Jesus is like. It doesn't matter what stage you're in. In following Jesus, you might be undecided about following Jesus, or you may have been on the journey of following Jesus for some time, but the point is true wherever you are at. When Jesus calls, he calls you out into the deep. The deep is a place where following him doesn't make a lot of sense. It didn't for Peter. It defies all human logic. The deep is when it just doesn't feel good to follow him. When you're exhausted, you're totally wrecked. This is all true for Peter. Maybe that's true for you at the moment. The shallows are the safest place for you, among the crowds. But what you have to see here is that Jesus actually turns from the crowds and he focuses in on Simon Peter, the individual, to show him something out there in the deep. And none of the crowds who stayed in the shallows got to see this. Jesus takes Peter out into the deep to call him to discipleship. Out in the deep, Jesus shows Peter his glory. And what you realize as you read through the Bible is that God often allows situations to get desperate so that he can reveal his glory. So that people will know it was God. It had to be God. There was no other explanation for it. It had to be God. You see this as you read through the Bible. It didn't make sense for the Israelites to go to the edge of the Red Sea, but little did they know that God was going to part it. It didn't make sense for Joshua's army to win the Battle of Jericho by circling it, blowing trumpets, but God brought the walls down. It didn't make sense for Gideon, who had a 32,000 strong army, to whittle his army down to just 300 men, but God gave the victory. And it didn't make sense for Peter to go out fishing during the day after a fruitless night of fishing, but Jesus filled the nets. Out in the deep, Jesus showed Peter something that defined human logic. If there was anything that Peter knew, it was fish. He knew fish, but this wasn't normal fishing. This was like the words of Psalm 8 as somebody who has authority over the fish and knows the pathways of the fish on the bottom of the sea. It's like he's the Lord of all creation. This reminds me of Dr. Francis Collins. He was a leading doctor of the Human Genome Project. And he spent his whole life examining what makes up human DNA. And yet his whole life he rejected God. He rejected any idea of there being a higher power until one day he was treating an elderly sick woman on her bed. And she challenged him to go deeper, to look deeper. And he realized that he had never, ever sought deeper the truths of God. He'd never looked at the evidence. He'd been staring at human DNA for a long time in his life. He was a professor of human genetics. Yet this elderly sick woman, someone so weak, challenged him to look deeper. And he went about and he looked deeper and he saw the glory of God shine through in the design of human DNA. He found Christ through the weakest of circumstances when it didn't make sense. He didn't have any care to look for it. He was challenged to look for it, and it defied all his logic, all the logic that he'd ever leaned on. Science. He stared into God's glory, and he found that it defied his logic. Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of God. Creation tells of it. This means that God shouts his glory. He shouts with the clouds. He shouts with the blue expanses of the world. He shouts with the stars and the galaxies. Out in the deep, Jesus shows Peter his glory. This is personal. I love it, the fact that Peter had actually seen God heal his mother-in-law. Maybe he wasn't such a big fan of that or something. But he'd actually seen Jesus heal his mother-in-law, and yet Jesus gets very personal with Peter. right into his profession, to the thing that he knows best, and he shows him his surpassing glory. He's the master fisherman. He's the Lord of all creation. It's what Jesus does out in the deep. When it doesn't make sense to follow Christ, when you're exhausted, when it defies all your logic, Jesus wants to show you his glory, his surpassing worth. And what always happens when Jesus does that is you come to the end of yourself. This is what you see happen here with Peter. He comes to the end of himself. He throws himself down at the knees of Jesus. He says, "Depart from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." It actually dawns on Peter here, how could I be in this man's presence? This is a big part of what happens when you come to know God for real. Your eyes are totally open to the holiness of God, and it devastates you. Because all the guilt of your sin, all of those things come up to the surface. They've been pushed down for so long, and you've sort of been kind of denying them and pushing them down for so long. But when God's glory exposes it, you're devastated. You realize I couldn't bear to be in this man's presence, his holy presence. This is why, addicts and adulterers, they struggle to come into a church because that's where the presence of God is. And so it exposes them for who they are. They don't want to experience that. And yet what we see here is that even Peter, somebody who does actually obey Jesus, finds himself unworthy. This is true for us today. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter what good works you've ever done. All of us find ourselves in this place. All of us have to find ourselves in the light of God's glorious perfection, have to find ourselves imperfect and in desperate need. We're in desperate need. You can't bypass this step of realizing your need. You can't bypass it. You can't come into a church and sort of join the club of the church. You can't do that. You actually have to come in, and the only way you become truly part of his church is to experience your worthlessness. To be truly shattered, broken by your sin. What's beautiful here is that Jesus doesn't leave Peter begging in fear. Actually, he says these comforting words. He says to him, "Do not be afraid." Why does he say that? I think it's because Jesus knows here that he has actually come to die for Peter. He's come, this is why his very business, his very purpose of being here on the earth is to come and to die for Peter and to take out that humiliation, to actually take out that stain of his worthlessness and his sin. He doesn't want to leave Peter stranded. He doesn't leave anybody stranded who gets to their knees and says, "I'm worthless before you." You notice the only people that God will leave in their sin are like those people that we saw last week in the synagogue. When Jesus came to them, they didn't think that he was worthy to be in their presence. And so they tried to chuck him off a cliff. But Peter is different. Peter comes, he sees his glory, he gets down on his knees, he says, "Depart from me." That's something that Jesus can work with. That's a heart that attracts the grace of God. You realize that all you have is need. All you have is need. That's all you bring to the table. And Jesus comes and says, "Do not fear. I've come and I'm going to take out that stain. I'm going to take out that humiliation." I love this picture in the book of Hosea. He goes to the prophet Hosea. He says, "I want you to marry a woman named Gomer." The only problem is that Gomer was a prostitute. And not long after, Hosea realizes that Gomer is not the ideal wife. She starts having children with other men. In fact, Hosea is so anguished by this that he calls one of those children "not mine." He's anguished by it. You can imagine how hurt Hosea is, and as it gets worse and worse and worse, it just drives the sword in deeper into his flesh. And eventually, Gomer just leaves him and she goes from man to man, and the final man that she's with sells her into slavery. Well, imagine Hosea, he turns to God, he says, "Why did you make me marry this faithless woman?" And what you realize in the poetry of this text is that what God is doing is he is showing Hosea what it's like for God to be in covenant with people and for them to constantly cheat on him, to constantly be faithless to him. And Hosea is showing him what this is actually like, to be in covenant with people that constantly reject. And so God says to Hosea, Hosea, I want you to go to Hosea. She's there. She's in the marketplace. She's being bid on by other men. She's standing naked. She's desperate. She's hopeless. And I want you to purchase her back. Then you'll know what it's like to be me. So imagine Gomer, the woman who is cheated. She's standing naked. She's being bid on in the marketplace. She's desperate. She's hopeless. And all of a sudden, as she hears the bids coming from her from different men, all of a sudden she hears the voice of her husband, Hosea, who's there. And in that moment, she's not thinking, great, I deserve this. She's not thinking that. She's thinking, Hosea, depart from me, because she looks at him. And as she looks in his face, she realizes, I'm not worthy. After everything I have done, I'm not worthy to be in his presence. But Hosea, he goes up to her and he puts new clothes on her and he says, you are my wife and you're coming home with me. This is how Peter feels standing here in the light of God's glory, in the presence of the glory of Jesus. He's not worthy. He's come to the end of himself in the glorious presence of Christ. But Jesus comes to him and says, do not fear. Do not fear. You know, God's grace it's too deep for words. It's too deep for words. It's like hearing from the surgeon after an operation, yes, we got it all. It's like when you get your semester grades and there's that one course that you just knew and thought you were going to flunk, but then you go through your grades and you realize you scored higher than you could ever imagine, and you're like, how did that happen? It's like a bride walking down the aisle on her wedding day, long-awaited wedding day. It's like the young man who is a drug addict who comes into church and then stands up and tells everyone he's free from it and thanks the church from praying. Those moments are like, this is too deep for words. This is what God's grace is like. You never reach the bottom of it. You never reach the end of his grace. This is what Jesus has come to do for Peter. He turns in to Peter to focus on him. He wants to show him his glory. He wants to bring him to the end of himself. He wants to show him his covering grace. Do not fear. I've come to take the humiliation, the stain, the worthlessness out. It's too deep for words. And then what you see out in the deep then is Jesus give Peter a new purpose, a whole new purpose in life. Do not fear, he says. From now on. Don't you love those words? From now on. What does that tell us? New beginning. New beginning. Do not fear. That's all that. But from now on, you're going to be catching men. You're going to partner with me. You're going to walk with me, and you're going to do my purposes. You're going to live out my purposes, and you're going to build my kingdom from now on. This is a new beginning for Peter. All of that is in the past. It lies in the past. This is my new purpose for you. This is what Jesus does when you meet Jesus. This is what he does for you. He gives you a new purpose. You know, in the past you had different purposes. When you meet Jesus, it's an encounter. It's such an incredible encounter. It's too deep for words, and it sets you on a different path. Peter's a commercial fisherman, but Jesus takes him out to the deep to change the course of his life. Notice that Peter's boat, it starts out as his profession, but then it kind of graduates. You know, as it graduates, it then becomes a pulpit for Jesus to speak from. Jesus starts speaking. He pushes the boat out and he speaks to the crowds. And so Peter's made his boat available for Jesus to speak. But then the boat graduates again and it becomes a metaphor for his new purpose, to walk with Jesus to build his kingdom. And often when we see here that Peter actually does this, he leaves everything, they come back in, he leaves everything and he follows Jesus. Often when we read this, you know, it comes across a bit depressing. Like, oh no, Peter had to leave his boat and the fish to follow him. And sometimes we struggle with texts like this where we see disciples that leave everything and follow Jesus because we think, I don't know if I could actually do that. Could I actually leave everything I know to go follow Jesus? It's kind of a bit depressing. It's a little bit too challenging. We want to try and work our way around that kind of thing. But I don't think that's how Peter felt. You realize what he just saw. How he just encountered Jesus. I was actually just reading this morning, Genesis. In Genesis, when God spares Lot's family from the sulfur raining down on Sodom, if you remember that story. Lot and his wife, they kind of reluctantly leave. They eventually leave. And you know that really interesting spot that happens where Lot's wife, she looks back on Sodom almost like longing for her old life. And she gets turned into a pillar of salt. I don't think that's what Peter was doing here. But I think that sometimes what we think it's like, we sort of look back on our old life as if that would be more desirable. But I don't think that's what's happening here in Peter. Peter's just seen the glory of Jesus and he's happily left his boats. He's happily left his profession. He's happily left the fish behind because he's now going to walk with the glorious Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He's seen his glory. When God brought me to the end of myself in 2011, I talked a bit about that last week. I never realized where it would lead. I was in a steady career. Michelle never wanted to be a pastor's wife. In fact, she was a bit dark about it for about 6 months ago when we were considering the idea to go into full-time ministry. And then one night, 6 months after we kind of prayed separately because I just kind of dropped it, she said to me out of the blue, "I think we should do it." And I said, "I think we should do what?" And she said, "I think we should do that church thing, the ministry, go into ministry. I think we should do that." And so I put in my resignation and people at my work took me out for coffee and they said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to throw away your career and do this?" And to be honest, if I was to be really honest, I wasn't sure. But God had called and I was realizing that when he comes in power, when he shows you his glory, there's no area of your life he won't touch. There's no area, your profession, your social life, your finances, all of that. There's no area he won't touch. This is not depressing. This is a privilege. This is the greatest privilege, is to pour your life out in service for him. And I think this passage does mean that some of us, in fact, all of us should consider at one point in our life, is God calling me out of the workplace to go into full-time ministry? That is one application of this, but it's so much bigger. It's such a bigger thing. That's not going to be for everyone. The bigger principle here is that there is no area of your life that Jesus won't touch. Make your boat a pulpit for Jesus to speak. Make your profession, your career, a pulpit for Jesus to speak. And I think what that means is that we need to consider, what are we aiming at in our lives? What is the aim of your life? You just think about what you've been thinking about for the last 2 weeks. What have you been aiming at? And it's interesting, I think the Apostle Paul, we find out in the New Testament, he was a tent maker. All right, but you would hardly know it by what he speaks about. You would hardly know it because his aim was Christ, right? And the tent making was just about supporting that aim of serving Christ. And I think we sort of do it the other way around. Our aim is the tent making, and we think that Christ is just to support us in our tent making. That's the kind of the way that we see it. Christ just supports me to live out my dreams. Rather than serving Christ is my aim, and here's what I do in order to support that aim. I really believe we need to rearrange our priorities. It's a privilege to serve God. There's no area, there's no part of your life that Christ won't touch when he calls. And in fact, Michelle and I were reading this passage out the back this week, and we just wept. We wept over this passage because we said, let it not be our story. Let it not be the story of our lives that there was this one time where God called and we left my job, went to America, came back and planted a church. And that was the one time we sacrificed. That was the one time we responded to his call. You know, that time when we were young and stupid. Let it not be that. Let it be whenever Christ calls and says, come out into the deep, we're willing to say, at your word, I will follow. There's no area of life that he will not touch. Sometimes I feel like my faith is like me just sitting in like a really nice warm spa with the bubbles on being massaged. You know, God is massaging me. Rather than actually diving into swimming in his glorious expanse, swim out into his ocean of what he has for me. I wonder if we might pray that, Lord, there's no area of my life that's off limits to you. Also, what we see here is that there's no place it won't reach. What you realize by this point, when Jesus says to Peter, you'll be catching men, what you realize by this point is it's actually, in Jesus' mind, it's metaphorical. You realize that the amount of fish that have come into the net and the boat is symbolic of the amount of people that Jesus is going to populate his kingdom with. People are going to come in from everywhere. There's no place that this calling will not reach. It's going to go to the ends of the earth. It started off in Galilee with a few simple fishermen. It's gone all across the world here to Little Adelaide, South Australia. It's crossed the world. And I was thinking about this because I get spammed emails this week. I always get spammed emails because I'm a pastor. And the spam emails I get are ones like this: 20 ways to grow your church in 2020. That's the spam emails I get, and I look at it and I despair. Because what these emails do, and as you look down the list, they have all these little points about how you could grow your church to break the 200 barrier. And I think, man, this is so small-minded. This is so small-minded. This call, there's no place in the world this won't reach. This call won't reach. I was so inspired. I've been so inspired recently by a young guy that some of you will know. He spent a year with us in 2017. His name's Charlie. And for the last 6 months or more, he's been banging on the door of the City Reach family of churches, Lawson at Marion, Timon at Oakton, and myself. He's been banging on the door saying, will you support me financially? Will you support me financially for me to go back to my home country in Poland to plant a church in a part of Europe that no one cares about? And when we were kind of first listening to this, in our minds are thinking, oh man, this is kind of a bit hard for us at City Reach. We're just small and we're just starting out and we're just trying to reach our little area in South Australia, and it's kind of like, I don't think we can do this. But to his credit, Charlie would not take no for an answer. And he just kept banging on the door. He just kept coming saying, I believe in this. Will you support us? Will you support me to go and plant a church in Poland? And first, we kind of held back and we felt like this was too big, but amazingly, as we've prayed, God has actually opened up doors that we could never have imagined, so that City Reach, as a family of churches, as part of our Reach 10 budget, is going to support Charlie to go to Poland to plant a church, to preach the gospel in a part of Europe that no one cares about. He's leaving the Henley Beach to go to the freezing cold temperatures of Poland because he believes that there's no place that the call of Christ will not reach. There's no place that the gospel will not reach. And lastly, there's no person that God will not use. We see Simon, Peter, we see James and other men. They're all just common, uneducated men from Galilee. Jesus chose them because there's no person he can't use. He couldn't use those guys who really knew the scriptures really well in the synagogue because they rejected him. They wouldn't come down low before him. They wouldn't say that all we need is you, Jesus. He couldn't use them, but he would use the common uneducated men, fishermen, who would come down low and say, all we have is Christ. He would use them. In Acts 2, the Holy Spirit comes and these men preach the church on fire, and everyone marvels, because aren't they uneducated? There's no area of your life it won't touch. There's no place it won't reach. There's no person that Christ won't use. So why don't you put out into the deep? Why don't you go in your thinking and in your prayers to a place that doesn't make sense, that doesn't necessarily make logical sense to you? Put out into the deep. Trust him. There's some practical steps this morning that I want us to consider in order to follow his call, to put out into the deep. The first thing is this, is to commit to dealing with the things that are holding you back from total commitment to Christ. Commit to dealing with those things. What are those barriers in your life? Maybe it is fear. Maybe it is shame. Maybe you have a past that you're ashamed about and you think that that is holding you back from actually serving Christ. Or maybe it is actually comfortable living. I have stared in my soul this week to find out what those idols are, and that is one of those idols. Comfortable living. I don't want to upset the apple cart of my life. This is something that's holding me back from what Christ may do even more in my life and what he might do even more in your life. This is the moment that Peter truly committed. As I said, Peter had seen Jesus do some amazing things, say some amazing things and do some incredible miracles. He'd seen that, but this was the moment where everything just kind of got out the way and he totally committed to Christ and he followed him. The second thing is to commit to a pattern of small obediences. Commit to a pattern in your life of small obediences. Peter had objections. Peter was exhausted. His feelings didn't really make him feel inclined to follow Jesus and put down his nets. But what does he say? At your word, I will do it. At your word, I will do it. Change topic. I have really tight hamstrings often. And sometimes they get so tight, I'll go out into the backyard and I ask my wife, Michelle, just to kind of stand there while I lie on my back and for her to kind of lift my leg up to kind of stretch them out. And it's really painful. And usually, like the first one, it can only get about that high. She holds it there for about a minute. And then, interestingly, she's able to just tilt it a little bit more. And then a little bit more. And then a little bit more until my hamstrings are loose. This is actually what God does with us through small obediences. Just bit by bit, as you obey, he loosens up. How am I going to finish that metaphor? He loosens up the muscles of your heart. This is what he does through small obediences. He makes you more useful. He sets you apart for him. And I think this is important because there's certain things in our lives that no one else knows about, right? There's certain things, and there's certain things in my life that I just think, well, that doesn't really matter. You know, there was some things when I first came to Christ that I dealt with that were big, right? They were big things. And I thought that once I dealt with those big things, that then, you know, everything would be sweet. But what I'm finding actually as I go deeper and as Jesus sort of tilts me back further and further and further, even littler things bug me. They bug me. And in those moments, I need to actually heed the voice of God, heed the voice of the Lord and obey him in the small things. Peter couldn't leave everything. He couldn't leave everything and follow Jesus until he just put out the net, until he just obeyed him in the small thing. And I believe this is so true for us. We want to set ourselves apart as holy, even in the small things. And thirdly, the last thing is to commit to praying resurrection prayers. I'll go wherever you want me to go, Lord. Oh no, he said it. Oh, I'll go wherever you want me to go, Lord. I mean, this is such a scary thing to pray. Why, we're spooked by this prayer. Why would I ever pray this? But I think, we shouldn't be too in awe here of Peter leaving everything and following Jesus. We shouldn't be too in awe of any man's sacrifice. Because you got to remember, this is Peter, that when the crunch comes, he denies Jesus 3 times. So yes, in Luke chapter 5, he leaves everything. But you got to remember, just before Jesus died, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. So we should never be too in awe of a man's sacrifice, of a person's sacrifice. The amazing thing is, and I preached on this at Easter last year if you were here, in John 21, go and read it after the service, after Jesus' death and resurrection. Jesus meets Peter while he's out on a boat again. It seems like, because Jesus had gone, he'd died, he'd gone, that Peter went back to his old job. He went back to fishing. And Jesus, if you know the story, he calls out from the beach, put out your net over the other side. And guess what happens again? Just 1,000 tails of fish go flapping into the nets again. Sure, Peter left everything, but he failed over and over and again. And here Jesus comes with another fish miracle saying, remember my glory. Remember my grace. When you came to the end of yourself, remember when you came to the end of yourself? And since then, you failed me, and you failed me, and you failed me, and you failed me. and I'm still here, and I'm still with you. And what that means is that you can go out into the deep with confidence because Jesus has committed his life to you. He went down into the deep. He went down into the grave, and he rose again, and he lives. He exhausted himself. This is what you have to see about Jesus. There's no commitment, there's no sacrifice that we could make that he hasn't made that's deeper, that covers you. There's no bottom. There's no end to his grace. It's too deep for words, remember. So Christ has gone in deep for you so that he might catch you, so that he might bring you in. And so when you pray, may it not just be for the basics. May it be that you pray because Jesus lives today, because he has committed himself to you, because there's nothing that you can do, that you cannot have confidence that Jesus is with you in. He's in it with you. And so is Jesus calling you today to put out into the deep, no matter where you are? Maybe you've had doubts, you've had skepticism about following him. Is he calling you out to the deep, even if it doesn't make sense? Or perhaps for you today, you've been exhausted. As Ben talked about this morning, you've been weary. There's things that don't add up in your life. Jesus is calling you out into the deep. Trust him. Trust him. Let's pray. Father God, the centerpiece of this story is Christ. Oh Lord, may we not ever become proud of the sacrifices that we make. Christ has gone deeper still. Lord, I just pray for the person today who is exhausted, weary, as Ben said, of following. Lord, when the things don't add up, when everything within feels like you want to give up, oh Lord, I pray that we might see your glory, that we may find ourselves at your knees, that we may find you, Jesus, picking us up, committing to us again, telling us, do not be afraid. Lord, I pray, Lord, for anyone here tonight who has let certain things, Lord, keep them from total commitment to Christ. Lord, maybe for some here today, it is a scientific reason. Lord, it doesn't add up. Lord, maybe it's some kind of tragedy that has happened in their life, or whatever it is, Lord, whatever's holding back from total commitment. Oh, Lord, I pray that you'd reveal your glory, you'd reveal your comfort, reveal your grace. Lord, may we know deep in our spirit today that you've committed to us beyond what we could imagine. So, Lord, we just want to worship you. We want to praise you. We want to glorify you this morning. Lord, we ask that you would, by your Spirit, do whatever is required, Lord, in our hearts today. And may we be sensitive to your call. May we be sensitive to it, Lord. May we be willing to respond. Lord, I pray this in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.